So, in case we haven't met before, my name's Noah. I've been asked to do equip things before, but I've always said no, I don't want to do it. The one time I will do it is if you do religions. So here I am. They asked me to do Hinduism. I am a high school teacher at St. Peter's in Cambridge, and my main thing is religious education. I teach another subject, theology and philosophy. But Hinduism is one of the things that we cover during that course. So, kind of my wheelhouse to talk about other religions. So, here I am. Maybe we'll just pray before we kick in. Father, thank you for this time we can be here together today. Pray that you would help me to speak well, help me to speak truthfully, and to represent these religions with some charity. Pray that as we investigate Hinduism, that we would see how good you are and see the truth of your gospel as a better way. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I thought just a little bit of background just to, I think why I'm a big believer in studying other religions. I think it's pretty useful. When I talk to the students at school, I often mention how majority of the people worldwide are actually religious. So even though my class, 90% of them may be non-religious, don't have a religion, religion is actually the most common perspective to have. I think Christianity is number one at the moment. Hinduism that we're going to look at is number three. So one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to think about other religions is that as we engage with other people, even in New Zealand where we have a lot of Christians, we can't always assume a shared worldview perspective. One of the ways I like to think about worldview is as like a lens that we all have. So everything that we see around us that happens gets interpreted through this lens. And so religion is kind of one of those key lenses that helps us understand the world around us. And so, especially when we engage with people like Hindus, that's a very different lens to our own. So actually understanding what Hindus believe is going to be a really important way to get through to them and talk to them. Also, contextual evangelism, I put it as, when we engage with people from other worldviews, even though our message doesn't change the core fundamentals of what we're talking about, the gospel, the way we language that and approach it can sometimes shift to be able to make it more understandable from their perspective they're coming from. So even in Christianity, when we talk about sin, salvation, Hindus also use those words, but they're very different understandings of what those mean. So it's actually helpful for us to understand what they understand by that, so we can kind of shift the conversation to present that gospel truth more clearly. And they all kind of lean into each other a bit. But one thing I've found, just for me personally, as I've studied different religions, and if I'm honest, I've had to really grapple with my own faith in terms of if I'm challenging those other religions, I have to kind of think critically about what I believe. But what I've always come back to is, as I've looked at these other faiths, it really makes Christianity seem a whole lot better. The more I've dug into Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, it just makes Christianity seem so much more coherent and so much better pathway. And some people would be critical of, me teaching other religions to students, but I think in doing so, and even just faithfully representing them best I can, when we actually compare it back to Christianity, Christianity just makes a whole lot of sense and is actually a far better way than what these other religions have to offer. So I think it is a really useful thing for us to study other religions so that we can understand the worldviews that people come from, but also I think it does really strengthen our own faith in the process. Please do interrupt me and ask questions as we go. I don't really like being up here, so it's nice to break it up a little bit. So please do put your hand up if you have any questions. Just as an overview of Hinduism, and I should just make clear at the start as well that my approach in talking about Hinduism today is not going to be to try and dismantle the religion or to pick apart and show why it's completely wrong. I think what the best thing we can do today is actually just look at the religion as it's presented, try and be as faithful as possible. I was thinking before, I wonder if there's a Hindu Mandir somewhere doing an equip session on Christianity. And I was thinking, I hope how they do it is going to be faithful to what we believe, so have a bit of charity there. We don't want to stereotype or, go into avenues, but so we're just going to look at it for as it is. That's kind of my main intention here today. Hinduism is actually some would say it's the oldest kind of living religion today. No one knows exactly when it began. Some say about 4,000, 3,000 years ago. But it was in this region here called the Indus Valley. There's a river that goes through there. It's one of those early cradles of civilization. Of course, they reckon the rivers changed and all those civilizations there kind of got wiped out. But that's where people trace back the earliest kind of origins of Hindu belief as we have it today. I believe the Indus Valley, the Persians came over and they put the S at the front and it became the Sindhu. And then the Greeks replaced it with an H, and that's how we got the word Hindu. And then another group came along, dropped the front and added Iya on the end, and that's how we got India. So Hindu identity, Indian identity is all kind of encapsulated in this area here. If you're talking to a Hindu, they will typically not refer to their religion as Hinduism. They will call it Sanatan Dharma, which means the eternal path or the eternal way. That's their preferred name. So if you want to impress a Hindu, talk about it as Sanatan Dharma, and instantly you've kind of got it in. They know that you're respecting what they're talking about. It's, like I said earlier, the third largest religion globally, so at 1.2 billion people. So even though, like I say, here in New Zealand, it's about 2.9% of our population, it's not a huge proportion. Probably, when I read that statistic, I thought it feels bigger than that, but that's the numbers. Worldwide, Hinduism is huge. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand about Hinduism from the onset, and actually makes Hinduism really hard to talk about, is it's incredibly nuanced. So I could talk about Hinduism for an hour, and then another Hindu person could walk in, and they could have a completely different idea about what Hinduism is. So really what I'm putting forward is kind of some key fundamentals that most Hindus would share, but chances are you could talk to a Hindu person, tell them about what you learned, and it could be totally different. Very different to kind of Christianity. We have much more shared belief. Even though there's diversity, there's kind of a shared sense of what Christianity is. Hinduism is more of a way of life and a philosophy and catch-all term for a whole bunch of different beliefs. So, fair warning, everything you learn, if you might meet another Hindu and they toss it out the window. One of the tricky things about just starting with Hinduism and thinking about God, they do believe in God, but we've got some terms here at the bottom. Anyone know what these, like to take a crack at what they mean? Just to throw. What does polytheistic mean? Yeah, many gods. Monotheistic? One God. Anyone know which one we are on that one? Yeah, we're monotheistic. What about henotheistic? Anyone heard that one before? What's that, sorry? It could include 10 gods, but there's a more specific meaning here. It's essentially, a henotheistic religion is one that acknowledges many gods, but for the practitioner, they have the kind of primary worship of one in particular. So in Hinduism, for example, there is a plethora of gods that are acknowledged, but typically families will primarily worship one god in particular. So your primary god may be Vishnu or Shiva, but you acknowledge that the other gods exist. So pantheism, probably heard of that one? Yeah, God is in everything. Those chairs you're sitting on are currently God. You are God, we are all God, everything that exists is God. And in that sense, there's only one real entity, and that's just God. So Hinduism, anyone guess which one Hinduism is of these? It's all of them. Depends which Hindu you ask, but all of these terms really apply for Hinduism. And one of the tricky things that highlights thinking about worldview, you could argue these are all very Western study of religion frameworks. When we apply that Western thinking to Hinduism, it always pretty much falls short. They kind of don't fit the mold of the way we think. So when we want to engage well with Hinduism, it does kind of require a very radical shift in our thinking. Because where we see contradiction, Hinduism just says, yes, these are all true. I put this picture on here, that symbol. Familiar with that symbol? If you see that symbol, do you think Hinduism? Maybe? Yeah. This is, what symbol do we use for Christianity if we want to depict it? Yeah, the cross. So in Hinduism, this symbol here is kind of the symbol they'd use to denote Sanatan Dharma, and this is the or Om. So you may have heard of people when they go to meditate, they go Om. This is that word in Sanskrit, and believed to be the kind of sacred resonance that existed in the universe before anything was created. Before anything came about, there was just this Om. And so when Hindus do their mantras or meditation, they'll often invoke this sacred resonance, and that's why you'll hear them start with this Om. So if you listen to Hindu meditation, almost 9 out of 10 times, it'll start with this sound. Before I get to them, you're probably surprised to see monotheism up there because typically Hinduism is actually quite mischaracterized often as being purely polytheistic. We say they have all these gods, but Hindus, for the majority of them, they would actually argue that they're monotheistic in the sense that all of these gods that we see, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, Ganesh, Hanuman, they are actually all just manifestations of one true supreme spirit, which they call Brahman. And everything that exists in pantheistic worldview exists as Brahman. But Brahman is so far and hard for us to understand that the way we can connect to Brahman is through different manifestations, which are the other gods that we know. And so the way you connect to the supreme divine reality is through the worshipping of these other gods, like Vishnu, for example. So they're all those things. So it makes it kind of tricky to pin down. These are three of the main gods that Hindus typically worship. And as you can see, the Trimurti there, that's essentially a Hindu word for a trinity. I found it interesting that Hindus have this kind of trinity concept in their religion. But these are three of the kind of main deities for many Hindus. And as you can see, they each play a certain part in the role of our universe and its creation, its sustaining, and then its eventual end and demise. Brahma created the world, Vishnu preserves it, and then Shiva, you often know he has a third eye in his forehead, and Hindu belief says that one day when that eye slit opens, the world will be destroyed. Anyone know what happens next? What? Yeah, it starts again. Brahma will create it again, Vishnu will preserve it, and then Shiva will destroy it again. So you're probably familiar with the idea of Hindu reincarnation. that concept applies not just to us as human beings, but our actual universe itself exists in this perpetual cycle of rebirth. Some creation stories say that Vishnu was just lying there in the galaxy, and then a lotus flower came out of his belly button, and inside there was Brahma, and then he picked apart the lotus flower and then created everything. There's lots of different stories. But again, for Hindus, they're not really worried about which one's right. They're all just stories to talk about the fundamental reality of this world is here, and these are ways of explaining how it got here. I just added this. This is the life cycle of our universe. The Kali Yuga is the last cycle. Anyone guess where we are currently in this cycle? So it begins in the Treta Yuga and then ends in the Kali Yuga. Jordan? Almost. They would actually argue we are, do I have a laser pointer? We're like right there. The world's about to get restarted again. So we're in the Kali Yuga currently. We're in the final ages. So Shiva's going to make his move anytime soon. Yeah, there we go. So maybe that's something we can agree about with Hindus, that the Lord's coming soon. Here are just some other deities, just some simple drawings of them. So sometimes these gods, like Vishnu and Shiva, they also take on the form of avatars, and so they kind of step into our history and they do lots of different things. You probably heard of Krishna, maybe? We have Hare Krishna, who kind of, Krishna is their main god that they worship, forms out of Hinduism. Ganesh is one of my favorite ones, pretty easy to recognize with the elephant head there. Hanuman is another one of my favorites. He's kind of like an anime character in the sense that he has like special abilities and he can make himself, he can like change, he's like Ant-Man, he can make himself grow really big and stuff like that. But this is just a small selection of some of the gods that Hindus may recognize. Some people would say that there's millions of gods that Hindus could point to, but typically these are the ones that most Hindus are going to recognize. I included this video here. I thought it'd be fun to watch. This is, you know how if you have kids, you're probably showing them like Christian kids content on YouTube. That's not an exclusively Christian phenomenon to have like kids content. This is a video Hindu families may show to their kids, explaining to them how Ganesh got his elephant head. So I just find it really fascinating, seeing how they also do this stuff. It's only about 2 minutes long, so we'll just watch that. It's a very sweet story.
My name is Tanisha, and you probably see me everywhere. Do you know how I came to be? Well, let me tell you. Once upon a time, high up in the Himalayas,
Pretty cute, wholesome story, hey? I just really find it fascinating that they have that. I guess if they did Sunday school, that's the type of lessons they would have. I don't know if they act it out or not, but are there any questions so far? Dale?
I find it fascinating that there's so many bits of the Bible coming in, like even prosperity and intelligence. At Solomon, there's things from the Bible that have all been brought in for what they want, but they're not accepting the Bible.
Yeah. There's a kind of one of the interesting things you find as you study religion is that there's kind of base beliefs that all religions kind of share. For example, like the golden rule of love your neighbour as yourself. Pretty much every religion articulates that in some way. What that kind of shows me is that I think when I see those similarities, it's that kind of God's written on our hearts. There's this kind of inbuilt understanding that we have together, and people are trying to explain it in different ways. Hinduism is one of those types of religions where they have a god of this, a god of that. So if you go to like a Hindu shop, sometimes you'll see that they have a little statue of Ganesh, the one we just looked at, in the front of their shop, because Ganesh represents prosperity and the remover of obstacles. And so even in a Hindu mandir, which is their place of worship, the first god you'll see is usually Ganesh, and you'll usually pay respects to Ganesh, and it's kind of removing off the obstacles that you're bringing into that place of worship. I think it's true. One of the things you'll see, lots of religions all have some pretty much shared values that we would have as Christians. It's just their way of trying to articulate those things that I think God has put on our heart. Are there any other questions before I move on? No? If you're thinking it, someone else might be thinking it, so please do ask. This is what I would say is, we'd probably park here for a little bit. One of the more fundamental aspects of understanding Hinduism, this is what they call the cycle of samsara. So samsara in English is basically reincarnation. This is essentially how life, death works for the Hindu. You'll see they have this concept here called Atman. Atman means the soul. So we fundamentally are our Atman, our soul. This body that you inhabit is just a bag of flesh that one day your Atman will put off. There's a quote in the Bhagavad Gita, one of their books, that talks about this. We'll take off this flesh, just like changing our clothes, and then when we die, we're born again, and we'll take on a new life, a new body. But the fundamental constant is not the physical, it's that Atman, it's our soul. And the goal of the Hindu is to achieve something called moksha, which essentially is escaping from the cycle of rebirth. That's the goal of the Hindu, is not to go to heaven or go to some eternal dwelling place, but rather actually to escape the cycle of rebirth. I remember when I was younger kind of hearing about reincarnation, being told that I could be reincarnated as a dog or something, thinking it was kind of cool. But for Hindus, this life that we're trapped in is kind of like their hell. They are stuck in this cycle, because we understand as well that life isn't actually always, we're not merrily rowing our boat. Life is tough, and when you put it on an eternal perspective, that we're just constantly subjected to this experience of having to be born, suffer, go to work, pay your taxes, die, over and over and over again. For Hindus, they see that actually as a negative. And so they're wanting to escape from that cycle. And to escape from it, moksha has been described as a reuniting with Brahman. How I've heard it pictured by some Hindus is you're a little drop of water, and then you go bloop into the big lake that is Brahman. All your individuality, all of who you are, is just completely absorbed into Brahman, and you're no longer subjected to this cycle of rebirth. So it's quite a fundamental, different understanding than a Christian would have about things like salvation and such. Jordan?
How many times do Atman get reincarnated?
Infinitely, is my understanding. Just over and over and over again. So, Hindu belief, all of us here, we've had many, many lives before this. There are some Hindu groups that try to practice some form of meditation where they like reconnect with past lives. You know, there's kind of like echoes that carry on. And that's why you'll hear people say, you know, oh, in my past life I must have been this because I have this kind of feeling, you know. I've got this word here. That was a good question, Jordan. Yoga here. Yoga means to unite. So we're familiar with yoga in the sense of, you know, doing poses and such, kind of an exercise. But yoga as a concept for Hindus is actually much broader than that. And they would argue that the way we achieve moksha is through this pathway of the 4 yogas. So the first one is karma yoga. This is essentially, if we're probably familiar with karma, the kind of law of cause and effect. If you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. And karma, even in the cycle of rebirth, you guys must have all done something pretty good in your past life because you're blessed enough to be here right now. So you got a good life in this one. But if you do bad deeds in your next life, you will reap that. And so you may be reborn as someone who doesn't have such a good life, or even reborn as an animal or an insect, for example. So karma, for Hindus, one of the ways they can achieve moksha, if they're going to follow, some Hindus choose to follow which path they want to. It's kind of pick your own adventure. So if you're following karma yoga, you're achieving moksha through doing good deeds. You're working for your salvation there, I guess. Jnana yoga, that's the path of knowledge. I've heard this is the hardest pathway to achieve moksha. So not many people attempt this, but it's essentially dedicating your life to learning everything there is to know. Hindus argue that we live in this state of what they call maya, which means ignorance. And so part of the Hindu life is to try and overcome that ignorance and realize the reality of the world around us and realize the reality of Brahman. And so through jhana, they can study, usually devote their lives underneath a guru of some sort, and through that, they may be able to achieve moksha. Raja yoga, this is where we get like the movements of yoga starting to come in. So this is self-discipline, meditation, involving yourself in chanting and doing different mantras, learning how to still the mind. So those who are practicing Raja Yoga, that's one of the ways they do those practices, is their way of working to achieve moksha. If you can master yourself, master your mind, through different postures or controlling your breathing in certain ways, you may be well enough to achieve moksha, not be reborn in your next life. And then Bhakti Yoga. This is one that I would say is probably one of the more common forms for not Muslims, Hindus. This is devotion to your God. So if you practice something called Shaivism, for example, you are devoting yourself to the god Shiva, and through prayer, through worship, through offerings, if you can live life well as a good devotee to your God and do what they wish and please them, that's another way you can also achieve moksha. Some Hindus would argue that the best path is actually to incorporate all of them. Others, you kind of pick your own way. Any question there? Yes?
So when you think of reincarnate, do they choose their own what they eat? Very far as the good, and is there any kind of order of like
Yeah.
start with an animal or start with an insect? You kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
order and I think
Yeah, there's no order form that you place and request, unfortunately for them. But these realities like samsara and karma, for Hindus, they're just as real as gravity. You know, they're just concepts that are true for them. So, because I kind of always had that question, well, who decides? You know, is there some entity that is putting people into a sorting box and saying, well, you did this, so you get this? But Hindus don't really think about it that way. It's just the reality and the natural order of things. So samsara has its way of just working. But essentially, your life that you're born into is you reaping what you sowed. If you have lived this certain way, your next life is going to represent that in some way. This is also why Hindus typically are vegetarian, because for all you know that sheep that you're eating could be your long-lost distant relative. And so they take that quite seriously, the killing of animals, because they realize those animals have that Atman in there. I've got a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, one of their books, and there's this cool picture in there of it's a cow with a human head being killed by a person with a cow head, and it's kind of touching on that idea of, what goes around comes around. You kill the cow in this life, next life you'll be the cow that's getting killed. So that's kind of how it works. Does that kind of answer? Yeah. There's no real rules to it in that sense. Yes?
Yeah, how do they come across all these names?
These names?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of them in Hinduism. It's just their language, their concepts. They would probably look at some of the things we use as Christians, justification, sanctification, complementarianism, and they probably think, how do they make up these names? That's just the same thing, I guess. But I think Sanskrit is the language that they use. That's kind of the holy language, like how Muslims would use Arabic. For Hindus, the holy language is Sanskrit. That's what some of their most ancient religious texts are written in.
Is it right that Sanskrit was the first language ever written?
Potentially, yeah. It's very, very ancient. Yeah, super ancient. Jordan?
I'm curious, is there an unforgivable sin, like for Atman, and that completely cuts them off from reincarnated, getting to moksha? Like, is there something that, like a sin that someone can do that would completely cut them off?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't heard of anything like that. I have heard, ultimately, my understanding of Hinduism is everyone is in the final state is redeemable, but you work towards it. So if you think about someone who has done something really, really terrible, and if you think about reincarnation as different states, and here's the lowest, and here's the highest before you reach moksha, if you've lived a really, really bad life, you'll pretty much just get dropped right down to the bottom. Some Hindu thoughts do have this kind of realm of hell. Kind of sounds a bit like Catholic purgatory. So there's this place of kind of suffering and refinement that you go through if you've done something really bad, and then you'll get back into the cycle, and you just work your way back up again. Yeah.
How long is that, say, purgatory?
Depends what you've done. Depends how long the universe decides that you need to be there for before you kind of learn your lesson. Yeah. Howard?
Who decides what you've done is good or bad? In this situation, you think, well, all Hindus must be really, really good, and love people, and do all sorts of things, and none of them would do anything bad.
Yeah.
It's going to push them down.
Yeah.
So, what's good and what's bad in there?
Yeah, so that's where, for the Hindu, maybe if you're following Jnana Yoga, and that's where you would look to the religious texts, or you would get the advice of your guru or swami. They would kind of give you the guidelines on what the moral life looks like, I guess. Just like for us as Christians, when we want to understand what is true, what is good, we would go to God's word. Hindus would do the same. But they would also place a lot of emphasis on the specific guru that they're following as well. A lot of Hindu morality is very similar to Christian morality. But you also have good Hindus and bad Hindus. You have Hindus that don't take their faith as seriously, so they're not really thinking about it, just like we do with Christians, Hindu might look at what we say and say, man, Christians should be the best people in the world when they study our beliefs. But unfortunately isn't true. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a good question. Dale?
How, as Christians, can we interact with a Hindu? Is there anything that would make them start thinking about the God of the Bible?
Yep. I think the idea of karma, I think, is a real bridge into discussing with a Hindu. We as Christians actually have a really wonderful way to offer, and actually such a wonderful hope. For the life of a Hindu, there's a lot of baggage and burden that comes with this, And that's something we understand as Christians, is that we are free in Christ. He has done the work for us. He has paid the price that we deserve to pay. And I think there's something, for the Hindu, that's actually something really important that we highlight, that actually Jesus has earned all the karma for us. He has lived the perfect devotion. He has done the perfect practices. He fulfilled the law of God perfectly, but he's done that for us, and that's something we receive as a free gift of God's grace through faith. So for me, this is why, like when I talk about Hinduism in class and then we contrast it to Christianity, Hinduism is just and this is pretty much every other religion we'll study as well. There's this real burden on the self to have to be good enough. And there's no real way of knowing whether you've ever reached that point. People who ascend to moksha don't come back, so we don't really know what that is. But yeah, Christianity offers such a greater hope. And the students see that as well. When we talk about God's grace and mercy that he's shown us through Jesus, that's when the class goes quiet, right? Because they understand there's actually something to that. Yeah, Shane. 5 minutes left. Oh, look. Okay. I think this is pretty fundamental to understanding Hindu belief. This is one of the things that pretty much every Hindu is going to agree on. Thank you, Dale, for asking that question. Yeah, that's helpful because I wasn't going to get to it. Maybe we'll probably finish around here. Hindu religious text is very different to Christian text. We have the Bible, and they have hundreds of different texts. So that's why that jnana yoga is really hard to do, because it would expect the mastery of all Hindu text. And there's a lot to get through. But they have two key kind of distinctions in how they would delineate between their religious texts. They have Shruti texts, which means that which is heard. So that came about through these rishis or ancient sages who received this as divine revelation. And so Shruti texts, such as the Rig Veda, which includes a book called the Upanishads, those are divine in origin. So those are kind of the fundamental religious texts in Hindu thinking. But on the other side, we have Smriti texts, which is that which is remembered, and these are texts which come about through human origin. But for the typical Hindu, most of the time they would read these texts. So that's where we get things like the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana, and a lot of the stuff that expounds on the Vedas. It's kind of like, if you know about Judaism, how they have the Talmud and such, that's like the Talmud side. and that's the Tanakh side. So very different way of approaching their religion, and that's one of the reasons why we have such diversity in Hinduism, is some groups will favour different texts over others, and from a Western lens, we would read those texts and would say, well, this one says this one says that. Complete contradiction. For the Hindu, it's just different ways of saying the same thing. Even with the Ramayana, Prince Rama goes and saves, it's very much like a Super Mario story. He goes, saves this princess from this demon king. But there's about 50 different versions of the Ramayana. Which one is the actual version? Not actually sure. But Hindus don't care about that because the lesson behind it is still the same. I was going to show a video, but that's okay. This is what a Hindu mandir may look like. This is where they go to do their worship. Unlike us, where we kind of pick a day of the week, Hindus can go anytime, whenever. There's no set day that they have to go. They just show up as they will and perform the rituals associated with being there in the mandir. That'll be lighting incense, paying homage to different shrines, because there'll be many gods usually depicted in those kind of sanctum spaces. And yeah, it's kind of easy breezy. There's no set liturgy or structure of how things be. You come and kind of do your worship. It's a very personal experience. Many Hindus too will also have personal shrines in their home. So if you ever go to a Hindu person's house, ask them, can I see your shrine? And it might spark a conversation. Jordan?
Is there do Hindus believe that Christ lived?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Jordan. Hindus, this is a good place to finish on. When engaging with Hindus, one of the tricky things for us as Christians is we try to present Christ as truth. They may very likely respond with, oh, that's really cool. Like, good on you for worshipping Christ. That's your God you're devoting yourself to. And they would understand Christ to just be another manifestation of Brahman and another way of seeking truth. They would probably argue that Jesus and Christianity is not the best way to do it. Their way is going to be a bit more effective. But they're going to be very accommodating to that. So the Hindu's going to have no issue with Jesus. And they would actually probably acknowledge Jesus as a really good guru, because when they think about the teachings of their gurus, Jesus actually presents a way that they would really admire and acknowledge quite highly. So that does make it really interesting speaking with a Hindu. But there's really interesting bridges to explore around thinking about the concepts of incarnation. What is that? For a Hindu, their gods come in the flesh. That's something we also have a concept of in Christianity, but we understand it slightly differently. But for us as Christians, I guess we're wanting to show, my kind of pivot would be thinking to point to the works of Jesus and what he has done for us on the cross. I think that's always going to be our most compelling kind of point of contact with a Hindu. Any other questions before we... I didn't quite get to kind of the witnessing part, how we kind of engage with a Hindu. When we do Sikhism next time, maybe we can touch on that a bit more. Sikhism is going to be really cool because it's essentially, if you know where Sikhism started in the Punjab region, we've got the Muslim world here, the Hindu world here. So Guru Nanak, the founder, he was basically a blend of both. So it's cool that we're doing Sikhism afterwards. Sam, very quickly.
Just wanted to ask, is there much value in trying to convince a Hindu that truth is exclusive and it can't be self-contradictory?
It's tricky because Hinduism, that Eastern kind of understanding of truth and knowledge is very different to how we understand it in the Western world. You know, very much we live in more of a postmodern age now, but that's probably more resonant with the Hindu than kind of that modernist plea for objective truth. Where we may be looking for truth, they're not really seeking that same type of explanation. They're quite content with actually living in mystery and acknowledging multiple truths. They would say the universe is not that simple, So that would be quite an undertaking, I guess. Yeah. Okay, we'll finish there. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll see you next week for Sikhism. There's lots of